Hello and welcome to EE233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to delve a little bit more into strings. And particularly, we're going to focus on some of the functionality in our core.h and our core.c. And what we'd like to do is start working on some of the functions that I provided you earlier. Specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to revisit our file read and our file read line. And then we are also going to take a look at some of the additional string functions. Let's start first with our file read and our file read line. So now remember that your core.h is your header file. You can sort of think of that as a contract, if you would. And the core.c is the file that actually contains the code. The idea here is your prototypes and your definitions would go into your core.h, and you may pass that along to someone else, and you keep your core.c or your implementation of your code. So what we want to do now is we're going to start with the file read. If you have watched an earlier video, you should have seen a discussion about fgetC and fscanf. And for the remainder of these videos, I'm going to focus on fscanf. And so what we want to do is we want to briefly revisit how do you read in the contents of a valid file. So to begin with, I want to go ahead and create a file input pointer. I'm also going to create a temporary variable that I'm going to call count. And what we want to do is we want to use our fopen to open the file, set it equal to the input file pointer. So we have input is equal to fopen. We want to specify the file name. And in this case, since our goal is to read the file, we want to open it with reading privileges. We want to then check to see whether or not the input file pointer is equal to null. So in this case, if input not equal to null, then we want to read the contents. I'll reword this just slightly, read the characters in the file. And we want to store them, which means that we're going to need one more temporary variable, and we're going to just simply call that a chunk. And then if the file does not exist, what we'd like to do is we'd like to notify the user. So error %s does not exist. And in either case, we want to return the total number of characters that were pulled out of the file, or the count. And so in order to be able to do this, we want to go ahead and initialize count equal to 0. And then as soon as we have verified that we have a valid file, or at least we don't have a non-null input file pointer, we want to remember to close that file. And we want to use a while loop to read the characters, in this case, character by character. So we want to use fscanf. We want to specify the input file pointer. We want to specify %c, and this could be replaced with different data types. And then we want to store it in the location of the chunk. And while this is not equal to end of file, we want to do a couple of things. First of all, we want to increment the count, and we also want to store the contents, or rather the current chunk at the location of contents, square brackets, count. Now, you'll note that I did type the count ++ first. That's just because To be quite frank with you, that's the line that you're most likely to forget to increment your count. So I always like to try to do that first whenever I'm doing something like this. But you notice, though, that we need to start with count equal to 0. In other words, the 0th location in the contents array. Now, from an earlier discussion, we talked about the fact that we may have too many characters in the file, so we do need to be aware of the maximum that we can store. And one way to do this, if we are not dynamically creating or dynamically allocating the memory in our contents array, is to check to see that our count is still less than our chunks count max, or chunks length max rather. We'll use the chunks count max in just a little bit. All right, so at this point then, we essentially have what we did earlier. We loop through each one of the characters in the file until we either hit end of file, or we exceed or meet or exceed the chunk length max, in which case, either way, we're going to exit out of the while loop. But the goal is that our contents is going to be a string. And so much like in the earlier example, we need to leave room for that end of string character. And to do that, we want to set then the limit for the number of characters that we can store in our contents to be chunk length max minus 1, such that when we exit out of our while loop, we simply say contents square brackets count is equal to that end of string character. And what this does is this guarantees a string, a valid string. Now, one discussion that we did not have in the previous video was what would happen if, in fact, the file did not exist. So would we return the count? Would that be all that we would be satisfied with? Or do you also want to initialize the contents square brackets count equal to end of string? So one of the things that you could consider, depending on how you wanted your code to behave, is that you could move this particular line right here out to the return. And so right before the return. So let's think about what would happen here. So essentially, if the file did not exist, not only would you get a count equal to 0, but the 0th element of contents would be the end of string character. So at least if the calling function didn't handle the return value correctly, at least it wouldn't be given an empty character array or a malign character array that could lead to a problem. Instead, what you would get is a string that essentially had no usable characters in there. In other words, a 0-length string. All right, so you could do it both ways, but I would suggest considering adding it here. Now, how do we do it differently when we are looking at our file read line? Well, our file read line basically wants to stop at an additional condition. So in other words, it needs to read not only while the file is open, but also we want it to stop when it reaches a new line. So just a couple of notes here. We want to stop at the end of file or a new line. The second thing to note here is that the function signature is different. In this case, we don't want to necessarily open the file and close it every time we try to read a line out of it. So note here that instead of a file name, we are passing a file pointer. And so the idea here is that we open the file once and we read a line out of it. Then we return to the calling function. do something with that line, and then the file is still maintained open. And at this point, then we can read the next line out of it. Okay, so we've got a couple of things then we want to check. So not only do we want to stop at end of file or end of line, but also, and this is one thing that we'll get to as the third condition, or when we have read too many characters. All right, so hopefully that scenario won't come up. I've given you another set of constants that are pretty high here. Hopefully we won't run into this. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to have an if statement that checks to see if our input is not equal to null. Okay, because if it is, then we have a problem. So in this case, printf error invalid file pointer. You've probably seen that error message at some point in your use of computers. But now what we want to do is inside of the true branch of the if statement, we want to build a compound while statement. So we're going to start off. The first one is going to simply be using an fscanf. Suppose I'm going to need some temporary variables here. Might as well go ahead and anticipate what some of these are going to be. So the first one is going to be a chunk or a character. I like to use a chunk. We're going to assume that we're going to be reading it in character by character. The second one that we're going to need is going to be a count. We don't need a file pointer because it's passed to us. So we'll start with these two right here, and we'll see where they get us. So we'll start first with our fscanf, and we want to pass to it our input file pointer. We want to collect a character using %C. We want to store it in our chunks or chunk rather variable. And as long as that is not equal to end of file, we want to continue going. The second condition then that we need to check is that the chunk is not equal to the new line. And then the third is going to be that our count is less than our chunk length max. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to assume that we could theoretically have a file that's 1,000 characters long with all on one line, in which case we're going to actually use the same argument that we did before to keep the chunk length max -1. So if any of those three conditions are violated, then we are going to get kicked out of the while loop. And so before we forget, we're going to increment the count. But what we're going to do is, unlike before where we were, or similar to before where we were storing it in contents, essentially what I'm going to do now is I'm going to store the current chunk in the line variable. So essentially this is the exact same approach that we took earlier. Now, once we exit the while loop in the earlier example, we would close the file. Well, if we close the file after reading a single line, then we'd have to reopen it. We'd essentially open it at the beginning of the file again. So instead, what we want to do is we want to leave the file open. We want to return the count, and then right before we return the count, we simply want to say line square brackets count is equal to our end of string. This guarantees that a line is going to be properly terminated. It's going to be a properly terminated string. All right, so what we want to do real quick is we want to go ahead and build this particular one. And let's see where our errors are real quick. Seems I have accidentally missed an ampersand here, and let's try that one more time. All right, I'm seeing red, but I'm not actually getting any compile errors, so I'm going to assume that my code is working correctly. Sometimes what you will have to do then is reparse the project, and in some cases you actually have to close and reopen NetBeans. All right, so at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to leave testing these two to another video. Hopefully you've found this example useful. I'll post a follow-up video with us actually using our Filereadline and Fileread functions. As always, if you've got any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me.